Hi everyone, let's continue learning. Now we are going to learn about learning. Let me share my screen. And just give me one time. Learning, adapting to the environment, habituation and sensitization. Evolution, adaptations transferred further to new generations. Learning is the process by which experience produces enduring and adaptive change in an organism's capacity for behavior. What to learn? Events that are important for survival and well-being, stimulus that signals something important will happen, whether its responses will have positive or negative consequences. Habituation and sensitization. Habituation. People get used to a stimulus and in the end stop paying attention to it. For example, people stop hearing the clock that ticks. Sensitization or dishabituation. It's the opposite of habituation. A stimulus is more and more intrusive, an increase in the strength of response to a repeated stimulus. For example, other people's small talk in the end becomes the only thing we hear, that we are unable to focus on other things. Both habituation and sensitization happen at the same time and compete to determine our behavior. They're both learning, whereas behavioral performance is the result of the two learning processes. Sorry for the typo error. Why habituation? In situations where a stimulus creates less arousal, habituation wins. Why sensitization? In situations where a stimulus creates more arousal, for example, when it's more painful or more complex, sensitization wins. For example, infants' visual inspection gets gradually less and less, usually habituates, but when they find something interesting, they first gradually increase their looking towards it, sensitization, and then habituate. This shows that both habituation and sensitization are at play. Early on learning, sensitization has the greatest effect on behavior, performance, whereas habituation wins later. When is it habituation or sensitization? If organisms respond to every stimulus in the environment, it will be exhausting. By learning not to respond or habituating to uneventful familiar stimuli, organisms conserve energy and can attend to other stimuli that are more important. There are some situations where it's not useful to ignore stimuli when we are learning a lot from them. For example, watching an interesting TV program or when they are a threat to our survival. For example, walking on glass with bare feet accidentally. Classical conditioning. Associating one stimulus with another. Classical conditioning. An organism learns to associate two stimuli, for example, a song and a pleasant event, such that one stimulus, the song, comes to elicit a response, feeling happy, that was originally elicited only by the other stimulus, the pleasant event. Pavlov's pioneering research. Renowned physiologist who conducted research on digestion in dogs that won him the Nobel Prize in 1904. Classical or Pavlovian conditioning. Dogs have a natural reflex to salivate to food, but not to tones. When a tone or other stimulus that ordinarily didn't cause salivation was presented just before food powder was squirted into a dog's mouth, soon the sound of the tone alone made the dog salivate. Basic principles. Acquisition, the period when a response is being learned. The tone is a neutral stimulus, as it doesn't elicit salivation. The salivation responds to the food, reflexive. It's what dogs do by nature. The food is unconditioned stimulus, UCS, a stimulus that elicits a reflexive or innate response, UCR, without prior learning. No learning is required for food to produce salivation. Salivation, an unconditioned response, UCR, a reflexive or innate response that is elicited by a stimulus, the UCS, without prior learning. Classical conditioning is strongest when there are repeated CS-UCS pairings. The UCS is more intense. The sequence involves forward pairing. The time interval between the CS and UCS is short. Extinction and spontaneous recovery. Extinction, a process in which the CS is presented repeatedly in the absence of the UCS, causing the CR to weaken and eventually disappear. Each occurrence of the CS without the UCS is an extinction trial. When Pavlov repeatedly presented the tone without the food, the dogs eventually stopped salivating. The key to extinction is not the time passing by, but repeated presentation of the CS without this UCS. Spontaneous recovery. The reappearance of a previously extinguished CR after a rest period and without new learning trials. The dog eventually stops salivating to the tone. Later, if we present the tone along, the dog may salivate once again. Timing. The temporal relationship between the CS, the tone, and the UCS, the food powder, was important. The timing and the order in which they were presented. Temporal contiguity. It was sufficient that the CS and UCS were presented close together in time. Generalization and discrimination. Stimulus generalization. Stimuli similar to the initial CS, the tone, elicit a CR, salivation. Through stimulus generalization, animals develop an alarm response to a range of rustling sounds. Some will be false alarms, but safe is better than sorry. Discrimination. When a CR occurs to one stimulus but not to others. For example, Michelle's fear of cars was widespread, but it didn't occur when she saw bicycles, trains, or aeroplanes. Higher order conditioning, sometimes referred to as second order conditioning. A neutral stimulus becomes CS after being paired with an already established CS. For example, pair a black square just prior to the tone, but we don't present any food. After repeated pairings, the square and tone, the square will become CS and elicit salivation by itself. Applications of classical conditioning, acquiring and overcoming fear, exposure therapies. A patient is exposed to a stimulus, CS, that arouses an anxiety response, such as fear, without the presence of the UCS, allowing extension to occur. Attraction and aversion. Aversion therapy. Attempts to condition on aversion, a repulsion, to a stimulus that triggers unwanted behavior by pairing it with a nauseous UCS. UCS sickness and health. Through classical conditioning, our bodies can learn to respond in ways that either promote or harm our health. For example, an allergic reaction. Classical conditioning can often explain the appearance of physical symptoms that don't seem to have a medical cause. Anticipatory nausea and vomiting. Many cancer patients develop anticipatory nausea and vomiting, or ANV. They become nauseated and may vomit anywhere from minutes to hours before a treatment session. Physiological treatments can help patients unlearn the ANV response. They may be taught how to relax physically, and then the conditioned stimuli that trigger the ANV are paired with relaxation and pleasant mental imagery. The immune system. Classical conditioning can help fight disease. Operant conditioning. Learning through consequences. Thorndike's law of effect. Law of effect. In a given situation, a response followed by satisfying consequences will be more likely to happen, and a response followed by an annoying consequence will be less likely to happen. Skinner's analysis of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a type of learning in which behavior is influenced by the consequences that follow it. Skinner box, a special chamber used to study operant conditioning experimentally. Reinforcement, when a response is strengthened by an outcome that follows it. Antecedent conditions and consequences. Positive reinforcement occurs when a response is strengthened by the subsequent presentation of a stimulus. Rat receives food pellets when it presses a lever, will eventually begin to press the lever more often. The stimulus that follows and strengthens the response is called positive reinforcer. Primary and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers, stimuli, for example, food, water, that organism naturally finds reinforcing as they satisfy biological needs. Secondary, conditioned reinforcers, stimuli that get their reinforcing properties through their association with primary reinforcers, for example, money. Secondary reinforcers show how behavior often depends on both classical and operant conditioning. Negative reinforcement. A response is strengthened by the subsequent removal or avoidance of an aversive stimulus. The stimulus that is removed, for example, a headache, is a negative reinforcer. Operant extinction. The weakening or eventual disappearance of a response because it is no longer reinforced. When the previously reinforced behaviors are no longer paid off, we are likely to abandon and replace them with more successful ones. Resistance to extinction, the degree to which non-reinforced responses persist. Aversive punishment. A response is weakened by the subsequent presentation of a stimulus, also called the positive punishment or punishment by application. For example, telling off children for misbehaving, the pain of touching a hot iron makes it less likely that we will do it again. If women wear a new blouse are liked by their friends, then they will wear it again in future. Response cost. The second form of punishment, also called the punishment by removal or negative punishment, for example, groundings, loss of privileges and monetary fines, removal or restrictions of allowances. Disciplinary techniques, aversive punishment and response cost have limitations. They suppress behavior but do not cause an organism to forget how to make the response. They tell us what not to do but not help us learn what to do. Thus, it's important to use positive reinforcement to strengthen desirable alternative responses directly. Shaping and chaining, taking one step at a time. Shaping, also called the method of successive approximations, involves reinforcing successive approximations towards a final response. Chaining, used to develop a sequence or a chain of responses by reinforcing each response to perform the next response. Generalization and discrimination. Operant generalization. An operant response occurs to a new antecedent stimulus or situation similar to the original one. Operant discrimination. An operant response occurs to one antecedent stimulus, but not to another. These antecedent stimuli, for example, parents' presence when a child is playing piano, bus markings, are discriminative stimuli. Children learn to rate the biscuit jar when their parents are not in the kitchen. We learn to get on the bus marked by specific symbols. Applications of operant conditioning. Social influence, a natural part of human existence. Skinner trained pigeons to direct missiles in the Second World War. Giant poached African rats have been trained to detect land mines in Mozambique because of their extraordinary sense of smell. Animals trained to perform remarkable behaviors, for example, police dogs. Observational learning, when others show the way. Observational learning, learning that occurs by observing the behavior of a model. Humans' capacity to learn by observation or modeling helps us save the time-consuming and dangerous learning process of trial and error. Bandura's social cognitive theory, also known by its former name, social learning theory, emphasizes that people learn by observing the behavior of models and having the belief that they produce behaviors to influence events in their lives. The modeling process and self-efficacy. According to Bandura, modeling has four-step processes that include some cognitive factors. Attention. We must pay attention to the model's behavior. Retention. We must retain the information in memory so that it can be recalled when we need it. Reproduction. We must be capable of reproducing the model's behavior or something similar to it. Motivation. We must be motivated to display the behavior. 4. Attention, retention, reproduction, motivation. Self-efficacy. People believe that they have the capability to perform a behavior that will produce a desired outcome. It's a key motivation in observational learning. Imitation of aggression and prosocial behavior. Viewing media violence decreases viewers' concerns about the suffering of victims, habituates us to the sight of violence, provides aggressive models that may increase viewers' tendency to act aggressively. Similarly, exposure to prosocial models enhances people's helping behavior. Thank you for listening and watching. I hope that you learned something today about learning. Let's continue learning.